Okay, girl, 6 years old, first grade. School won't give her an IEP because grades are good. On 504, which has just about nothing on it, got paper saying that she is autistic, ADHD, and sensory issues. She needs OT. 504 counselor said she doesn't look autistic, so we are not going to treat her as such, which I don't understand what that means. Look, I understand what you're saying, and I see staff make stupid comments like that all the time. I don't know what autistic looks like. I've got an autistic daughter, and I can tell you that she looks like her. And then other autistic kids look like them. Some, if you want to sit there and talk about some kind of common behavior, it sort of depends on the kind of autism they have. You have a high functioning kid, you can't necessarily distinguish them from anybody else. Other than those of us that have sort of an expertise in identifying some of those things. But at the same time, to sit there and be so, just let me finish this. And all kids have some kind of sensory issues, so, OT is not necessary. And I have a case currently just like this to where starting in 2019, and I believe she might even be around a little bit older than your child, that autistic, ADHD, very similar issues, and the parents have tried to get her eligible for an IEP for multiple school years, but they're saying that the grades are too good. Well, that's not, in the IDEA, it doesn't matter. A child can be advancing from grade to grade. It has nothing to do with two factors, whether your child has a disability or a qualifying disability and then is in need of specialized instruction. Those are the two caveats. It's not whether or not your child is making good grades. Grades are arbitrary, quite frankly, especially in our day and age to where we're doing more of a group work. I have cases like that to where I've got kids that should have IEPs that are flying under radars because they're doing group work, and they're able to sit there and I'm not going to say cheat because they're allowed to work in a group and submit their papers as a group. But the child's not being individually evaluated to the point where we can sit there and distinguish how they're performing individually. And so in situations like that, I don't trust grades. How are they doing on individual tests? Not necessarily their homework, because a lot of parents help their children with their homework. Then if you sit there and you layer in accommodation, sit there and being provided, a reduced work, or they can turn it in at a later time. Some of these things will mask a child's need for an IEP, and then the school will say, well, I don't need it. Look at their grades. So there's a lot of complexity in there, but with regards to just giving them a 504, well, that's a good starting point. But if that is not working, if the accommodations are not working, then, you have to have the data collection to sort of support that the 504 itself isn't working. But if the 504 isn't working because there's hardly anything on it, then you do have a right as a parent to file an OCR complaint. Office of Civil Rights, they have an army of attorney that can come in and sort of assist you with that. Or you can file a 504 complaint. Similar to an IDEA complaint. You can act as your own attorney. Every school should have their own internal process, and the school has to treat it in a similar way. The difference is that the state will assign a due process hearing officer at the state's expense. You might have to check your rules. I think you're in a Northeast state, but at the same time, most states, the internal 504 complaint process is that the school has to go out and find a neutral 504 hearing officer, one that understands. And usually it's your due process hearing officers, because the rules and the law are very similar with regards to the definition or a legal definition of free appropriate public education. So they can cross-utilize them like that. But there needs to be more meat on the bone on your 504. OT can be provided to address OT concerns. Also, behavior. They can have a behavior plan as an accommodation under 504. So some of the ADHD issues can be addressed through the 504 as well. It's just going back and pressing that these things are functions of a 504. These things can be added, and then I would be a little bit stern and say we need to add these things. Okay, and if you believe that an IEP is absolutely warranted, then you sort of I don't know whether your child is caught in their cycle of response to intervention, um, which is their problem solving. It's response intervention is the RTI aspect, to where your child could be in tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 of intervention. So you might need to ask whether or not they have your child in response intervention, because it's a school-wide program across the country, tailored for general education to try to prevent over-identifying children for special education. Then you don't have to consent as a parent. In a school can have a child in their RTI process, and have a lot of parents not even understand that their child is in RTI. So you might want to ask. The fact that she doesn't look autistic doesn't mean, but it's sort of trying to distinguish the difference between just needing accommodations. And just needing accommodations might be all that's necessary, but if they're not adopting those inside the 504, you can never really be clear. And you're not at that, if your child is high functioning autistic at 6 years old, and especially a girl, because a girl, it's so much easier for a girl, high functioning, first of all, not even to be identified, simply because a lot of our diagnostics for autism in general has been so predominantly male, and girls are much stronger communicatively in other areas than boys are. So a lot of girls, high functioning autistic girls, fly under radars, go into adulthood not diagnosed, because they've been able to fly under some of those radars that would typically be triggered if it was a male. So in that respect, where we typically see an increase in IEPs is when the child hits that third grade, fourth grade transition. The reason being is a lot of those other aspects that aren't necessarily apparent in that K through 3 where they're learning to read. Well, they flip that curriculum over to reading to learn, and it starts hitting some of those natural deficit areas for high functioning autistics, in the area of written expression and comprehension, language, if there's deficits in expressive or receptive communication or social communication. Those things tend to be sort of triggered at that point. But it's sort of laying the foundation of need. But if those accommodations are working, that's where I would start first, is really pushing for those accommodations to be memorialized inside the 504. And it needs to include other people in the team other than the counselor. And if you need to bring in the principal, and even have a discussion with the special education director or some of the special education staff, because there is a sort of an incompetence sometimes with our school counselors that oversee 504 implementation, to where they don't understand those nuances, and then they sort of view themselves as these gatekeepers to special education, or that next step in making these arbitrary determinations themselves professionally, that this child doesn't look autistic, this child doesn't need an IEP. I don't know why it matters to them. They shouldn't do that. And especially if they don't have the necessary expertise in understanding the nuances in the law and how interconnected 504 can be with IDEA in many, many respects. Okay? So I would start there, go back to the table, push for more accommodations that way, and then establish sort of detailed what the data collection would look like to ensure that the accommodations are working. And then also pay very close attention to how your child is performing individually on assessments or tests, and not necessarily on homework, because that's more of a determiner on whether or not they're struggling in those areas. But the homework tends to be a large part of a child's grade. And so if you see individual test scores be low, but the homework's high, and your child ends up with a B, you see where the school will come back and say, oh, well, they're doing just fine. Well, not really if you take their individual test scores into consideration and just sort of remove the homework as a factor. Okay, hopefully that works. And like I said, those would be where I would start before tiering into that next step of special education eligibility once again.